is going on?
December 14th, 2019. Margaret Walsh stood in a Minneapolis courtroom watching her husband of 12 years walk away with half of everything she owned. Her modest savings account, her 10-year-old Honda, even her grandmother's wedding ring. What Richard didn't know, what Margaret herself didn't know, was that at that exact moment, 900 miles away in a Chicago law firm, a file sat on a mahogany desk with her name on it. Inside that file were documents that would reveal Margaret wasn't just a middle-class nurse from Minnesota. She was the sole heir to a $2.4 billion fortune. 6 weeks after her divorce was finalized, Margaret's life would change forever. But Richard's decision to leave her, that would haunt him in ways he never imagined. This is the true story of greed, hidden identity, and the most expensive divorce mistake in American history. How does a billionaire's daughter end up completely unaware of her own wealth? Why did Richard really want a divorce after 12 years of marriage? And what happens when the man who divorced her for not being ambitious enough discovers what he just walked away from? The answers will take us back 37 years to where this story really begins, through a web of family secrets, ultimatums, and a deathbed promise that would only make sense decades later. Margaret Elizabeth Walsh was born in 1982 in Lake Forest, Illinois, one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. But she never knew it. Her mother, Catherine Walsh, had done the unthinkable. She'd fallen in love with someone her family couldn't accept, a public school teacher named David Foster. Catherine's father, Jonathan Walsh, was the founder of Walsh Industrial Holdings, a manufacturing empire worth billions. He had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single factory in Gary, Indiana, in 1953. And by the time Catherine was born in 1965, the Walsh name was synonymous with American industrial success. Jonathan was a man of rigid principles, old money values, despite being new money himself, and he had very specific plans for his only daughter's future. When Catherine brought David home to meet her parents in 1981, the evening was a disaster from the moment David walked through the door. Jonathan took one look at this young man with his worn shoes and public university degree and decided the conversation was over before it began. He gave Catherine an ultimatum that very night. Leave David, marry someone suitable from their social circle, someone he had already picked out, the son of a business partner, or lose everything. Catherine was 23 years old, pregnant with Margaret, and deeply in love. She chose love. Jonathan Walsh was a man who didn't make idle threats. Within a week, Catherine was written out of the will, cut off completely, her trust fund frozen, her credit cards canceled, and told never to contact the family again. Her mother, Elizabeth, was forbidden from seeing her. The family attorneys made it clear that any attempt to reach out would result in legal action. Catherine and David married in a courthouse ceremony with 2 witnesses they'd pulled from the hallway. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side, a world away from the Lake Forest mansion Catherine had grown up in. David worked as a high school math teacher making $32,000 a year. Catherine, who had never held a job in her life, took work as a receptionist at a dental office. When Margaret was born on March 15th, 1982, there were no baby showers, no silver spoons, no trust funds. There was just 2 people who had given up everything for each other, trying to figure out how to afford diapers. Margaret's childhood was defined by things other kids took for granted, but she never had. She wore thrift store clothes that didn't quite fit. She brought plain peanut butter sandwiches to school, while other kids had Lunchables. Birthday parties weren't at Chuck E. Cheese, but in their small apartment with homemade cake and games that didn't cost money. But what Margaret did have was love. Catherine and David never let her feel poor. They read to her every night. They took her to free museum days. They taught her that worth wasn't measured in money but in character, kindness, and hard work. Catherine never spoke about her wealthy family. When young Margaret asked why she didn't have grandparents like other kids, Catherine simply said they had passed away before she was born. It was easier than explaining rejection. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Margaret didn't know was that her grandfather, Jonathan Walsh, knew exactly where she was. He had hired private investigators to track Catherine's life from a distance. He received quarterly reports with photographs of Margaret at school, copies of her report cards, updates on the family's financial struggles. He knew when David worked a second job driving for a courier service on weekends. He knew when Catherine took on evening shifts to help pay for Margaret's school supplies. He watched from afar as his daughter struggled in ways she had never been prepared for, and he did nothing. His pride wouldn't allow it. His wife Elizabeth begged him to reconsider, to at least set up a fund for Margaret's education, but Jonathan refused. He had made his position clear. Catherine had made her choice, but something began to shift in Jonathan as the years passed. The quarterly reports showed him a granddaughter who was thriving despite having nothing. Margaret was top of her class. She volunteered at a local food bank. She had inherited her mother's kindness and her father's work ethic. By the time Margaret was 10, Jonathan had started to wonder if he had been wrong. Not about David, he still couldn't accept that, but about punishing an innocent child for her mother's choices. Still, his pride kept him silent. The Walsh family operated on principles, he told himself. Principles didn't bend for sentiment. When Margaret was 16 years old, Catherine started feeling tired all the time. She ignored it for months, attributing it to long hours at work. But when the pain became unbearable, David finally convinced her to see a doctor. The diagnosis came back on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It had already spread to her liver. The doctors gave her 6 months at most. Catherine was 42 years old. The medical bills were catastrophic. David's teacher insurance covered some of it, but the treatments, the medications, the hospital stays, they buried the family in debt. David took out a second mortgage on their small apartment. Margaret quit the volleyball team to work evenings at a grocery store. And through it all, Catherine never reached out to her father. She would rather die in debt than beg the man who had abandoned her. But as Catherine's condition worsened, as the treatments stopped working and hospice care began, she started having dreams about her father. In these dreams, he was old, sick, filled with regret. She would wake up crying, telling David that she felt something had changed, that somehow her father knew she was dying. David dismissed it as the medication, but Catherine became convinced. 3 weeks before she died, Catherine called Margaret into her bedroom. It was late January, snow falling outside the window, and Margaret sat beside her mother's bed holding her frail hand. What Catherine said that day would haunt Margaret for years. She told Margaret about her real family, about the grandfather she'd never met, about the Walsh fortune and the Lake Forest mansion and the ultimatum that had changed everything. She told her that Jonathan Walsh was not a warm man, not a forgiving man, but he wasn't heartless. She said that before she got sick, she'd had a feeling, a mother's intuition, that despite everything, her father had never stopped thinking about her, about the granddaughter he'd never met. Then Catherine said something that made no sense to 16-year-old Margaret. She said, "When you turn 35, someone will find you." "Don't reject it, Maggie. It's your birthright." Margaret asked what she meant. Catherine smiled weakly and said her father always believed 35 was the age when a person truly understood the weight of their choices. It was the age Catherine had been when Jonathan had offered one final chance to come home without David, and she had refused. Catherine squeezed Margaret's hand and said, "He'll wait until you're 35, because he'll want to know you became the person I knew you'd be. Promise me you won't reject it out of anger. Promise me you'll accept what's yours," Margaret promised, not really understanding what she was promising. 3 days later, on February 4th, 2004, Catherine died with David and Margaret by her side. She was 42 years old. The funeral was small, 15 people in a chapel that could hold 200. Margaret, still in shock, kept watching the door, part of her hoping that a wealthy grandfather she'd never met would walk through and reveal that her mother had been right. No one came. After the funeral, David tried to file a wrongful death lawsuit against the hospital, believing Catherine's cancer had been missed during earlier checkups, but the medical records showed she'd avoided doctors for years. There was no case. The debt remained. David Foster never recovered from losing Catherine. He tried to stay strong for Margaret, to keep working, to keep the apartment, but the grief consumed him. He started having chest pains in the summer of 2005. He ignored them, thinking it was stress. On November 12th, 2005, a David Foster collapsed in his classroom while teaching quadratic equations to a room full of sophomores. He died before the ambulance arrived. Massive heart attack. He was 49 years old. Margaret was 23, alone, and drowning in debt. The apartment had to be sold to cover what David owed. Margaret moved into a tiny studio in Minneapolis, a city she chose because it was far from Chicago and all the memories that haunted her there. She had $2,000 to her name, no family and no safety net, but she had her mother's words echoing in her head: hard work, kindness, character. Margaret enrolled in nursing school at the University of Minnesota using student loans and federal grants. She worked night shifts at a 24-hour diner, weekends at a retail store, and somehow still managed to graduate top of her class in 2009. She got a job at Minneapolis General Hospital in the intensive care unit. The work was brutal, emotionally exhausting, but Margaret was good at it. Patients loved her, colleagues respected her. She was making $48,000 a year, and for the first time in her life, she felt stable. In October of 2007, Margaret met Richard Donovan. It was a Sunday morning at a coffee shop near her apartment. Margaret was studying for a nursing exam, textbooks spread across a corner table, when Richard walked in. He was tall, handsome, well-dressed in a way that suggested money, but not arrogance. He ordered an espresso, noticed Margaret surrounded by medical books, and made a joke about doctors keeping him in business. Well, he was a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. They started talking. Richard was charming, confident, funny. He asked for her number. Margaret, who had barely dated since her father died, said yes. Their relationship moved quickly. Richard was everything Margaret hadn't realized she wanted. He was ambitious, driven, always talking about his next promotion, his sales targets, his 5-year plan. He took her to nice restaurants, bought her gifts she protested were too expensive, and told her she deserved to be taken care of for once in her life. For Margaret, who had spent her entire life taking care of others, it felt like someone was finally seeing her. 8 months after they met, Richard proposed. It wasn't elaborate, no flash mob or jumbotron, just dinner at a nice restaurant and a ring he'd saved for. Margaret said yes. They married in June of 2008 in a small ceremony at a Minneapolis chapel. Margaret wore a $200 dress from a department store. They honeymooned in Door County, Wisconsin, because it was all they could afford. Richard complained the entire trip that it wasn't the Bahamas, but Margaret thought it was perfect. The first few years of their marriage were happy, or at least Margaret thought they were. Richard's career was going well. He got promoted twice. His salary increased. They moved into a larger apartment. Margaret kept working at the hospital, her shifts often running 12 to 14 hours, but she loved the work. She loved her patients. Richard, however, started to change. The ambition that had attracted Margaret to him began to curdle into resentment. He wanted the big house in the suburbs. He wanted the luxury car. He wanted to join the country club where his bosses played golf. And Margaret's nurse salary, while respectable, wasn't enough to fund the lifestyle Richard believed he deserved. By 2015, the arguments started. Richard would come home from work events and complain about how his colleagues' wives didn't have to work, how they drove Range Rovers and summered in the Hamptons. He started making comments about Margaret's lack of ambition. Why hadn't she gone to medical school? Why was she still working floor shifts instead of moving into hospital administration? Margaret tried to explain that she loved patient care, that money wasn't everything, but Richard didn't want to hear it. He started working late more often. He became distant, cold. When Margaret suggested counseling, he dismissed it as a waste of money they didn't have, which was ironic considering he'd just bought himself a Rolex on credit. What Margaret didn't know was that Richard had already started seeing someone else. Her name was Jessica Hartman. She was a corporate attorney at a firm that represented Richard's pharmaceutical company. They'd met at a professional conference in 2017. Jessica was everything Richard thought a successful man's wife should be. She made $180,000 a year. She drove a BMW. She wore designer clothes and knew which wines to order at business dinners. She represented the life Richard wanted, and Margaret represented the life he was stuck in. Richard didn't file for divorce right away. He spent 2 years building a case in his mind, convincing himself that Margaret was holding him back, that he deserved better, that leaving her was actually the responsible thing to do because they clearly wanted different things in life. He never considered that he was the one who had changed, that Margaret was still the same kind, hard-working woman he'd married, and that his dissatisfaction had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his own insecurities. By the fall of 2019, Richard had made up his mind. He consulted with a divorce attorney. He moved money into a separate account. He prepared his exit strategy like it was a business transaction. October 3rd, 2019. Margaret came home from a 12-hour shift in the ICU. She was exhausted, her scrubs stained with coffee from a rush break, her feet aching. So she found Richard sitting at their kitchen table with a manila folder in front of him. Margaret asked if everything was okay. Richard slid the folder across the table without looking at her. Inside were divorce papers, already signed by him. Margaret's hands started shaking as she read the first page. She looked up at Richard and asked why. He told her, in a voice devoid of emotion, that he'd outgrown her, that she had no ambition, that he wanted a partner who could keep up with him, who wanted more from life than just getting by. Margaret started crying. She asked if there was someone else. Richard hesitated, then said it didn't matter, that this wasn't about another person. It was about them growing apart. He was lying. Jessica was waiting for him at a hotel downtown. Margaret begged him to reconsider. She suggested counseling, wanted a trial separation, anything but this. Richard stood up from the table and said he'd already made arrangements to move out. He'd be staying with a friend. His attorney would be in touch. And then he left. Just walked out of their apartment, out of their marriage, out of the life they'd built together. Margaret sat at that kitchen table until 3 in the morning, unable to process what had just happened. 12 years of marriage ended with a folder and a man who couldn't even look her in the eye. The divorce process was brutal. Richard's attorney was aggressive, pushing for the maximum allowable split of assets. Minnesota is a no-fault divorce state, which meant that everything acquired during the marriage was divided equally regardless of who earned what or who wanted the divorce. Margaret and Richard had a combined savings of $96,000. They owned their furniture. They had 2 cars, Richard's newer Audi and Margaret's 10-year-old Honda Civic. Richard's attorney argued that Margaret should take the Honda and Richard should take the Audi because it was necessary for his work. Margaret's attorney, a legal aid lawyer she could barely afford, didn't fight it. The only thing Margaret fought for was her grandmother's wedding ring. It had belonged to her mother's mother, Elizabeth, and Catherine had given it to Margaret before she died. It was the only piece of her family history she had left. Richard's attorney argued it was marital property because Margaret had worn it during the marriage. The judge ruled that if Margaret wanted to keep it, she had to buy out Richard's half of its appraised value. The ring was appraised at $2,400. Margaret paid Richard $1,200. She didn't have to keep her own grandmother's ring. On December 14th, 2019, the divorce was finalized. Margaret walked out of the courthouse with $48,000, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with 130,000 miles on it, half of their furniture, and a ring she'd had to buy twice. Richard walked out with the same amount of money, the Audi, and the certainty that he'd made the right choice. He proposed to Jessica that evening at the same restaurant where he'd proposed to Margaret 11 years earlier. Jessica said yes. Richard believed his new life was just beginning. Margaret moved into a studio apartment in a less expensive part of Minneapolis. Actually, the rent was $850 a month, which was all she could afford. She picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working 60 to 70 hours a week because the overtime helped, and because going home to an empty apartment was unbearable. She lost weight. She stopped sleeping well. Colleagues noticed but didn't pry. Margaret had always been private about her personal life. Friends from the hospital invited her to dinner, to game nights, to anything to get her out of her apartment. But Margaret always declined. She felt like a failure. Her parents had given up everything for love, and she couldn't even keep a marriage together. The holidays were the worst. Christmas 2019, Margaret worked a double shift because she had nowhere else to be. New Year's Eve, she fell asleep at 9 o'clock watching a movie she'd already seen. January dragged on. February was worse. And then, on January 28th, 2020, Margaret checked her mailbox and found a certified letter. It was from a law firm in Chicago she'd never heard of, Whitmore and Associates Estate Law. Margaret's heart started pounding as she opened it. Inside was a formal request for her to attend a meeting regarding the estate of Jonathan Edward Walsh. Margaret had to sit down on the hallway floor of her apartment building. That was her grandfather's name. The grandfather who had disowned her mother. The grandfather she had never met. The grandfather who, according to her mother, was impossibly wealthy. When the letter stated that Jonathan Walsh had passed away in October of 2017, and that there were matters regarding his estate that required her immediate attention, the meeting was scheduled for March the 16th, 2020, at 10 o'clock in the morning at their Chicago office. Margaret looked at the date. March the 16th was one day after her 38th birthday. One day after. And suddenly her mother's words from 14 years earlier came flooding back. When you turn 35, someone will find you. Don't reject it, Maggie. It's your birthright. But Margaret was 37, about to turn 38. If her mother had been right, why had it taken this long? Why now, just weeks after the worst period of her life? Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She called in sick to work the next day, something she never did, and spent hours researching Jonathan Walsh online. What she found was staggering. Jonathan Edward Walsh had been one of the most successful industrialists in American history. Walsh Industrial Holdings had manufactured components for everything from automobiles to aircraft to medical devices. At the time of his death, the company employed over 15,000 people across 12 states. His personal net worth had been estimated at over $3 billion. And this man, this titan of industry, was her grandfather. Margaret looked at photos of him online. She had his eyes, the same shape, the same deep-set quality. She could see traces of her mother in his face, in the strong jawline, in the serious expression. The weeks leading up to the meeting were agony. Margaret told no one, not her friends at work, not her former in-laws who she still occasionally spoke with. No one. She was terrified that if she said it out loud, it would turn out to be a mistake, a case of mistaken identity, a cruel joke. She took a personal day for March 16th and drove the 3.5 hours from Minneapolis to Chicago. She left at 5 in the morning, unable to sleep anyway, and arrived at the law offices of Whitmore and Associates at 9:30. The building was in downtown Chicago, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that made Margaret feel small. She was wearing the nicest outfit she owned, a black pantsuit from Target and flats that were comfortable enough for hospital shifts. In the elevator, she stood next to men in $1,000 suits and women carrying Prada bags. She had never felt more out of place. When the receptionist on the 42nd floor greeted her by name, which startled Margaret, she was led to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. 3 attorneys were waiting for her. 2 men and 1 woman, all in their 50s or 60s, all dressed like they charged $1,000 an hour, which they probably did. The lead attorney, a man named Charles Whitmore, stood and shook Margaret's hand. He gestured for her to sit. Margaret sat, and then Charles Whitmore told her something that seemed impossible. Jonathan Walsh had died on October 9, 2017, at the age of 87. He had been in declining health for several years, his mind sharp until the end, but his body failing him. Before his death, he had made significant changes to his will, changes that surprised everyone who knew him, including his own attorneys. Despite having cut Catherine off 40 years earlier, Jonathan had never stopped thinking about his daughter. He had hired private investigators, as Margaret would soon learn, to track her life from a distance. He knew about Margaret. He knew Catherine had died young. He knew David had died shortly after. And in his final years, Jonathan Walsh had been consumed by regret. The will stated that if Margaret Walsh could be located, and if she was determined to be of sound character and moral standing, she would inherit the entirety of his personal estate. Not the company that had been structured separately and sold to a conglomerate in 2016, but everything else. The real estate, the investment portfolios, the art collection, the liquid assets, everything. But there was a condition. Margaret could not be informed of the inheritance until she reached the age of 35. Jonathan had specified this in the will. He wanted Margaret to build her own life first, To prove she was her mother's daughter, to demonstrate that she had character independent of wealth. He didn't want to give her money when she was young and potentially reckless. He wanted to wait until she was established, mature, the age his daughter had been when he'd given her that final ultimatum. Margaret turned 35 on March 15, 2017, but the legal process of locating her, verifying her identity through DNA testing with samples Jonathan had left specifically for this purpose, and settling the complex estate had taken 3 years, or 3 years during which Margaret's marriage fell apart. 3 years during which she struggled financially, 3 years during which she worked herself to exhaustion just to keep her head above water. And now, sitting in this conference room overlooking a city she'd fled 18 years earlier, she was being told that all of it, all the struggling, could have ended 3 years ago if the paperwork had moved faster. Charles Whitmore slid a document across the table. It was a summary of the estate's assets. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she could barely read it. Real estate holdings in 7 states valued at $420 million. Stock portfolios and investment accounts totaling $900 million. Art, jewelry, and collectibles valued at $75 million. Liquid cash assets of $300 million. Trust funds and annuities worth another $650 million. The total value of the estate, after taxes and fees, was approximately $2.4 billion, and it was all hers. Margaret couldn't breathe. She stood up from the table, walked to the window, and stared out at Lake Michigan. The attorneys waited. They'd seen this reaction before, though perhaps not quite at this scale. After several minutes, Margaret turned around and asked the question that had been building since she opened that letter. Why? Why had her grandfather done this? If he'd felt this way, if he'd regretted cutting off her mother, why hadn't he reached out while Catherine was alive? Why make her struggle? Why make her die in debt? Charles Whitmore opened another folder and removed a handwritten letter. He explained that Jonathan had left several letters to be given to Margaret. This one was to be read first, in this room, before any papers were signed. Margaret took the letter. The handwriting was shaky but legible, written by an old man who knew his time was running out. It was dated September 2017, 1 month before Jonathan died. The letter began, "Margaret, I have never met you, but I have watched you your entire life. I know this will sound intrusive, perhaps cruel, but I needed to know what kind of person you would become. Your mother made a choice I couldn't accept at the time. She chose love over legacy, and I punished her for it. I told myself I was teaching her about consequences, about the importance of marrying within one's station, and about preserving what I had built. I was wrong. I was a stubborn, prideful old man who confused control with love." The letter continued. "I received reports about you quarterly. I saw your report cards. I knew when you made honor roll. I knew when you volunteered at the food bank every Saturday. I knew when your mother got sick and you worked 2 jobs to help pay for her treatment. I knew when your father died and you refused to declare bankruptcy, choosing instead to pay off his debt slowly, honorably. I watched you put yourself through nursing school without family support, without the advantages I could have given you, and I realized you had become exactly what your mother hoped you would be. You didn't need my money to have character. You already had it." Margaret was crying now, her tears streaming down her face as she read her grandfather's words. The letter went on. "I am giving you this inheritance not because you are my blood, though you are, but because you have earned it. You have lived a life of integrity, compassion, and hard work. You are everything I should have wanted in a daughter, in a granddaughter. I'm sorry I never told your mother this. I'm sorry I let my pride keep me from knowing you. Use this money however you see fit. Build a life. Help others. Or don't. You owe me nothing, but know that in my final years, the only thing I regretted was not having the courage to admit I was wrong while the people I wronged were still alive to hear it." The letter was signed simply, J.E.W. Margaret set the letter down on the conference table and covered her face with her hands. She sobbed. Not tears of joy, not yet, but tears of grief for everything that had been lost. Her mother never knew her father had forgiven her. David never knew his wife came from money. Margaret had spent her entire adult life believing she was completely alone in the world. And all along, there had been someone watching, someone who cared, someone who was just too broken by pride to reach out. Charles Whitmore gave Margaret time to compose herself. When she finally looked up, he explained the next steps. There would be paperwork, lots of it. There would be meetings with financial advisors, estate managers, tax attorneys. Margaret would need to make decisions about the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, the charitable foundations Jonathan had established. It was overwhelming. Margaret asked if she could take a few days to process this. Or Charles nodded and said, of course. But there was one time-sensitive matter. The press was going to find out. Estate filings were public record, and an inheritance of this size would attract media attention. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. Charles recommended that Margaret prepare herself for what was coming, perhaps hire a publicist or at least a security consultant. Margaret, who had never considered needing security in her life, realized her entire world was about to change in ways she couldn't even comprehend. She left the law office at noon with a folder full of documents, a check for $100,000 to cover her immediate expenses, and a feeling of complete disconnection from reality. She sat in her Honda Civic in the parking garage for an hour, unable to turn the key. And this couldn't be real. Any moment she would wake up in her studio apartment, and this would all have been a dream. But it wasn't a dream. Margaret drove back to Minneapolis in a daze. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. She went to work the next day, put on her scrubs, and took care of patients like she always did. But inside, she was falling apart trying to process the impossible reality of her situation. And then 4 days later, the story leaked. A junior paralegal at Whitmore and Associates mentioned the Walsh estate case to a friend who worked in financial journalism. That friend made some calls. By March 20th, 2020, the story was everywhere. Secret heiress found in Minnesota. Nurse inherits billions after grandfather's death. The Walsh fortune mystery solved. Margaret's phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. Reporters had found her address, her workplace, her friends. Camera crews parked outside her apartment building. Colleagues at the hospital stared at her in the hallways. Patients asked if it was true that their nurse was a billionaire. Margaret stopped going to work. She couldn't leave her apartment without being swarmed. Distant relatives she'd never heard of started calling, claiming close relationships with her mother, asking for loans, for investments, for just a chance to talk. Financial advisors sent unsolicited proposals. Charities flooded her mailbox with requests for donations. Scammers tried to trick her into giving them access to her accounts. It was chaos. Margaret hired security on the advice of her attorneys. She hired a publicist to handle media requests, which she declined all of. She hired a financial management team to help her understand what she actually owned. And through all of it, through the chaos and the media frenzy and the overwhelming life change, there was one person who was more shocked than anyone else. Richard Donovan. Richard first heard about it from Jessica. They were having breakfast in his apartment on March 21st when Jessica, scrolling through her phone, suddenly gasped. She turned her phone screen toward Richard and said, "Isn't this your ex-wife?" Richard looked at the screen. It was a news article with a photo of Margaret, looking overwhelmed and uncomfortable, being escorted by security into a building. The headline read, "Minneapolis nurse inherits $2.4 billion fortune." Richard read the headline 3 times. Then he read it again. And then he grabbed Jessica's phone and read the entire article. Margaret Walsh, recently divorced nurse from Minneapolis, has been identified as the sole heir to the Walsh Industrial Holdings fortune. Her grandfather, Jonathan Walsh, who died in 2017, left her an estate valued at over $2 billion. Walsh was unaware of her connection to the wealthy family until contacted by estate attorneys last month. Richard felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. The phone slipped from his hands. Jessica was talking, saying something about what an insane coincidence. But Richard couldn't hear her. All he could hear was his own voice from 5 months earlier, telling Margaret she had no ambition, that he wanted a partner who could keep up with him. He had divorced a billionaire. He had divorced a billionaire 6 weeks before she found out she was a billionaire. If he had waited. If he had just waited a month and a half. Under Minnesota law, any assets acquired during a marriage are split equally in a divorce. If Margaret had inherited that money while they were still married, Richard would have been entitled to half. $1.2 billion. Richard spent the rest of that day in a state of shock. He called his divorce attorney and asked if there was any way, any possible legal argument, to claim that he should have been entitled to part of the inheritance. The attorney explained patiently that the inheritance wasn't finalized until January of 2020, and the divorce was finalized in December of 2019. Richard had no legal claim to any of it. But the timing was just spectacularly, catastrophically bad for him. Richard asked about reconciliation, about whether a divorce could be reversed if both parties agreed. The attorney said technically yes, but it would require Margaret's willing participation, and given the circumstances, that seemed unlikely. Richard hung up and immediately started calling Margaret. She didn't answer. He called 17 times that first day. He left voicemails that started apologetic and grew increasingly desperate. "Maggie, please call me back. I know this is crazy, but we need to talk. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I still love you. I never stopped loving you. Please just give me a chance to explain." Margaret listened to the first 3 voicemails and then blocked his number. She knew exactly what this was about. Richard wasn't calling because he loved her. He was calling because he just realized what he'd walked away from. The next day, Richard showed up at Margaret's apartment building. Security stopped him at the entrance. He tried to push past them, shouting Margaret's name, begging her to just give him 5 minutes. Security called the police. Richard was escorted off the property and warned that if he returned, he'd be arrested for trespassing. Undeterred, Richard tried going to the hospital where Margaret worked. He was stopped at the nurse's station by Margaret's colleagues who had been briefed on the situation. One of the senior nurses, a woman named Patricia who had worked with Margaret for 8 years, told Richard in no uncertain terms that if he didn't leave immediately, she would personally call the police and press charges for harassment. Richard tried to explain that they didn't understand, that he and Margaret had a connection, that this was all a misunderstanding. Patricia told him that what she understood was that he'd divorced a good woman and now regretted it because of her money, and that made him exactly the kind of person who didn't deserve Margaret. Richard left the hospital in humiliation. His final attempt was going to Whitmore and Associates in Chicago. He drove there on March 25th, walked into the reception area, and demanded to speak with someone about Margaret Walsh's estate. He claimed to be her husband. The receptionist politely informed him that their records showed he was her ex-husband, and that he had no legal standing to discuss the estate. When Richard refused to leave, not building security removed him. The entire incident was captured on security cameras, and when Margaret's attorney showed her the footage, she made it clear that under no circumstances was Richard to have any contact with her. A formal cease and desist letter was sent to Richard's address. If he attempted to contact Margaret again, legal action would follow. Jessica broke off their engagement 3 days after the news broke. She told friends that Richard had become obsessed with his ex-wife, that he talked about nothing else, that he'd made the stupidest financial decision in human history, and she wasn't going to spend her life with a man who would always be looking backward. Richard's colleagues at work found out. The story was too big, too viral for people not to make the connection. Richard became the guy who divorced a billionaire right before she found out she was a billionaire. He was a joke, a cautionary tale, the personification of bad timing and worse judgment. His boss made a comment at a sales meeting about doing your due diligence before walking away from something valuable. The entire room laughed. Richard started having panic attacks. He couldn't sleep. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning doing math in his head. $1.2 billion. That's what he would have gotten. He could have retired at 43. He could have bought anything, gone anywhere, done anything. Instead, he was still working, still driving an Audi he could barely afford, still living in an apartment that felt smaller every day. Margaret, meanwhile, was trying to figure out who she was in this new reality. Once the initial media frenzy died down after a few weeks, helped by Margaret's refusal to give interviews or make public appearances, she hired a team of advisors, financial managers, attorneys, and publicists, and they helped her create a plan. First, she secured her assets. Everything was placed in trusts and managed portfolios that would generate income while preserving the principal. Second, she made a decision about work. She loved nursing, but she couldn't go back to Minneapolis General Hospital. It wasn't safe, not with the media attention, And it wasn't fair to her colleagues or patients who deserved care without cameras and reporters hovering. So Margaret made a choice that surprised her advisors. She decided to open free medical clinics. By the end of 2020, Margaret had funded the construction of 3 free clinics in underserved communities. One in South Minneapolis, one on the south side of Chicago where she'd grown up, one in Gary, Indiana, where her grandfather's first factory had been. Each clinic was staffed by doctors, nurses, and support staff who provided care regardless of a patient's ability to pay. Margaret funded them entirely, creating endowments that would keep them running in perpetuity. She named them the Catherine Foster Clinics, after her mother's married name. She wanted her mother's legacy to be about the love and sacrifice that had defined her life, not the Walsh money that had rejected her. Margaret also donated $50 million to pancreatic cancer research at the University of Chicago Medical Center. She established a scholarship fund for children of single parents trying to attend nursing school. She gave $20 million to the high school where her father had taught, funding a new science wing and a permanent endowment for teacher salaries. She was quietly, methodically using her wealth to honor the people who had loved her when she had nothing. But she didn't become the socialite Richard had always wanted. She didn't buy a mansion or a yacht or a private jet. She bought a modest house in a quiet Minneapolis suburb with good security and a fence for privacy. She drove a new car, nothing flashy, just something reliable. She dressed well but not ostentatiously. She avoided parties, galas, and social events where wealthy people gathered to be seen. Margaret did agree to one interview in late 2020 with a journalist from a major newspaper who had been respectful in her coverage. In that interview, Margaret said something that perfectly captured who she was. She said, "Money doesn't define you. My mother was worth more than any fortune, and she died with nothing. My grandfather had billions and died with regrets. I'm not going to let this money change who I am. I'm going to use it to become more of who I already was, someone who cares for people, someone who helps. That's what my parents taught me. That's what I want my life to be about." The interview went viral, but not in a sensational way. People respected Margaret's grace, her humility, the fact that she hadn't let sudden wealth corrupt her. She became, in a strange way, a folk hero. The woman who was always rich and never knew it. The woman whose husband left her for not being ambitious enough, only to discover she was a billionaire. The woman who used her fortune to honor her parents instead of herself. But the question everyone wanted answered was, what about Richard? What happened to the man who made the worst decision in modern divorce history? Richard Donovan still lives in Minneapolis. He still works as a regional sales manager for the same pharmaceutical company, though he's been passed over for promotion twice since the story broke. He drives the same Audi, though it's aging now and needs repairs he keeps putting off. He lives in a smaller apartment after Jessica left, something he can afford on his own. And according to people who know him, people who still talk to him, he thinks about Margaret every single day. He follows news about her charitable work. He saw the article about the clinics. He knows about the scholarships and the research donations. He knows she's living the exact life he told her she was too unambitious to achieve. In 2022, Richard did something that made headlines one final time. He filed a lawsuit against Margaret seeking a portion of the inheritance. His argument was that the estate should have been disclosed during divorce proceedings and that he had been defrauded by the timing of the information. It was a desperate, pathetic legal argument with no basis in law. The case was dismissed in 14 minutes. The judge, a woman in her 60s, told Richard from the bench that greed was not a legal foundation for a lawsuit and that his attempt to profit from his ex-wife's inheritance after divorcing her was one of the most distasteful filings she'd seen in 30 years on the bench. The dismissal was covered by every major news outlet. Richard became a joke all over again. Margaret never responded publicly to the lawsuit. Her attorneys handled it, but privately, friends say it hurt her. Not because she was worried about losing money, but because it confirmed what she'd already known. Richard had never loved her for who she was. He loved the idea of who he thought she should be, and when she didn't meet that idea, he'd walked away. The money just made his true character impossible to hide. As of today, Margaret Walsh lives a quiet life. She never remarried. She's been asked, or in interviews and by friends, if she's open to dating, and she's always given the same answer. She says she's not opposed to love, but she's not looking for it either. She's happy, she has her work, she has her clinics, she has the knowledge that her parents would be proud of the person she's become. That's enough. But here's the question this story leaves us with. Was Richard a victim of terrible timing? A man whose only crime was divorcing his wife a few weeks too early? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Was it just cosmic bad luck that he left Margaret right before her life changed? Or was it justice that a man who valued ambition and wealth over love and character ended up with neither? Margaret was asked this question once in that single interview she gave, and the journalist asked if she felt any satisfaction knowing Richard regretted his decision. Margaret thought about it for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't think about Richard at all. I hope he finds whatever he's looking for. But I learned a long time ago that you can't build a life with someone who's always looking for something better. My parents taught me that love isn't about what you have. It's about who you are." Richard never understood that. Maybe he does now. I hope so. But it's not my concern anymore. And maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not that Margaret got her fortune and Richard lost his chance, but that Margaret understood something her grandfather took a lifetime to learn. That character matters more than wealth. That love matters more than status. That the richest life isn't measured in billions. Wait, but in the people you help, the values you hold, and the peace you find in knowing you stayed true to yourself even when the world told you to be someone else. Margaret Walsh was a billionaire's daughter who didn't know it. Her husband divorced her for not being enough, and in the end she proved she was always more than enough. She just needed the world to catch up. So what do you think? Was Richard a victim of bad timing, or did karma deliver exactly what he earned? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story as incredible as we did, make sure to subscribe, because next week we're covering another true story that will absolutely blow your mind. Thanks for watching.